There's a rule in global finance that nobody talks about. It's not written in any treaty. You won't find it in the Charter of the World Trade Organization. No parliament ever voted on it. Yet this invisible rule has decided the fate of entire nations for decades. It determines who gets rich and who stays poor, who trades freely and who begs for permission. And for the longest time, nobody dared to question it. Until now. In the heart of West Africa, a young military leader named Ibrahim Traoré just did something that sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington, Brussels, and London. He didn't fire a single shot. He didn't nationalize foreign assets. He didn't default on debt. What he did was far more dangerous to the established order. He turned on the lights. He opened the books. He invited the world to watch as Burkina Faso sold its gold, not through the shadowy channels that have enriched middlemen for generations, but in broad daylight, with cameras rolling and every document available for scrutiny. And here's what makes this story truly remarkable. The gold sold at benchmark prices, $2,050 per ounce. No discount, no penalties, no hidden fees extracted by faceless bureaucrats in distant capitals. For the first time in recent memory, an African nation proved that transparency could be more profitable than the opacity that has characterized resource extraction on the continent since colonial times. But this story isn't just about gold. It's about power, it's about dignity, and it's about a question that every nation in the global south is now asking. If Burkina Faso can do this, what's stopping the rest of us? Let me take you back to where this all began, because the full picture is even more extraordinary than you might imagine. Picture this. You're a mining minister in a landlocked African country. Your nation sits on billions of dollars worth of gold reserves. Your people are poor, but the wealth beneath their feet could transform everything. Schools, hospitals, roads, jobs, all of it within reach. There's just one problem. Between your gold vault and the international market stands what insiders call the compliance corridor. Nobody officially announced the creation of this corridor. There was no press conference, no international agreement, no moment when the world's nations gathered to authorize it. It simply appeared, like morning fog, quietly settling over the trade routes between Africa and the rest of the world. But, unlike fog, it never lifted. Here's how it worked. Say you wanted to sell your gold. First, you'd need to ship it through specific European refineries. Not just any refineries, mind you, but the approved ones. Then you'd need insurance from particular firms. Again, not just any insurance companies, but those deemed acceptable by an undefined authority. Your bank would need to process the payment, but suddenly they'd start asking for documents you'd never heard of before. Environmental impact assessments from consultants in Geneva, social responsibility certificates from auditors in Amsterdam, chain of custody verification from laboratories in Zurich. Each step added cost. Each checkpoint extracted a fee, and most importantly, each gatekeeper had the power to say no, not because your gold was impure, not because you'd broken any law, but simply because the system had been designed that way. The corridor wasn't just a route, it was a chokehold disguised as compliance. For Burkina Faso, a nation that produces more than 60 tons of gold annually, this corridor represented a tax that nobody voted for. At market prices, 60 tons equals roughly $3.5 billion, but Burkina Faso never saw that full amount. By the time the gold passed through all the gates, all the approved checkpoints, all the necessary intermediaries, the price had somehow dropped. Not by a little, by enough to matter. Enough that miners in Ouagadougou waited weeks for wages. Enough that schools sat without electricity. Enough that the gap between what the earth gave and what the people received could fill entire budgets. They called it the African discount. As if geography itself was a crime that demanded punishment. And for years, African leaders accepted this reality. Some because they benefited from the arrangement. Others because they saw no alternative. A few tried to resist, only to find themselves isolated, sanctioned, or worse. The message was clear: play by the rules we've written, or don't play at all. Then came Ibrahim Traoré. The meeting took place in a secure room in Ouagadougou. No press, no cameras. Just Traoré and his closest economic advisors staring at a problem that had paralyzed bigger nations than theirs. On the table sat reports from mining companies, bank statements showing delayed transfers, and testimonies from workers who hadn't been paid in a month despite sitting on wealth worth millions. One of the ministers spoke first. "Mr. President, we can negotiate. Perhaps if we offer the Europeans better terms on the next concession, they'll ease the restrictions." Traoré looked up from the papers. His expression was calm, but everyone in the room could feel the intensity behind his eyes. "Negotiate what? Our dignity? Our right to sell what belongs to us?" Another advisor chimed in, more cautiously this time. "With respect, sir, we need their refineries. We need their insurance. We need their banks. The entire system runs through them. If we push too hard, they could shut us out completely." This was the crux of the matter. For decades, this fear had kept African resources flowing through channels designed in European capitals. The fear of isolation, the fear of being cut off, the fear that independence might cost more than dependence. Traoré stood and walked to the window. Outside, Ouagadougou bustled with life. Street vendors sold mangoes and phone cards. Motorcycle taxis weaved through traffic. Young people sat in internet cafes, dreaming of futures that the current system would never allow them to reach. He thought about the miners, men who descended into the earth each day, risking their lives to extract gold that would travel thousands of miles away before anyone calculated its true value. When he turned back to the room, his decision was made. "We're not negotiating. We're not begging. We're building something new." He laid out the plan with precision that surprised even his most experienced advisors. Burkina Faso would conduct public gold auctions. Not private sales hidden behind non-disclosure agreements, not deals brokered in hotel suites, public auctions where every step of the process would be visible to anyone with an internet connection. Every bar of gold would be stamped with a serial number. Every assay result would be published. Every insurance contract would be uploaded in full. Every payment would be documented. The custody chain from mine to vault to buyer would be tracked with more rigor than most Western banks applied to their own assets. "If they say we're too risky," Traoré explained, "we'll give them so much documentation they'll drown in proof. If they claim our gold doesn't meet standards, we'll invite independent auditors from 3 continents to verify it. If they insist we must use their corridor, we'll build our own roads and dare them to explain why transparency is somehow more dangerous than their secrecy." One advisor raised the obvious concern. "And if no one buys?" Traoré smiled for the first time that afternoon. "Then we'll know the truth, that this was never about standards or compliance or risk, that it was always about control. And once we know that, so will everyone else." The plan was audacious. It was risky, and it would either revolutionize how African resources moved through global markets or become a cautionary tale about the price of defiance. 3 weeks later, the first auction went live. The morning of the first auction, something unprecedented happened. Television crews from across Africa were invited into Burkina Faso's National Assay Laboratory, not for a brief photo opportunity, for the entire process. Viewers watched as technicians in white coats carefully extracted gold bars from secure containers. Each bar was placed on a calibrated scale. The weight appeared on a digital display visible to the cameras, 12.441 kilograms. Then came the purity test. A small sample was taken, dissolved in acid, analyzed through spectroscopy. The result flashed on a screen: 99.197% pure. A technician held up the bar to the camera. Stamped into the metal were 3 things: a serial number, the weight, and the purity level. This information, the technician explained in French, translated live into multiple languages, corresponds exactly to the digital certificate that buyers will receive. Nothing is hidden. Nothing is approximate. In the background, another team was filming the custody log, a leather-bound book that looked like it belonged in a 19th-century merchant's office, except every entry was also being digitally recorded and uploaded to a public blockchain. Name of the mine, date of extraction, name of the transport company, name of the security personnel, name of the laboratory supervisor. Each person signed both the physical book and the digital record. This wasn't just about proving the gold was real. This was about proving that an African nation could implement systems that exceeded the rigor of institutions that had questioned their competence for decades. In Geneva, insurance executives were watching. In London, commodity traders were taking notes. In Dubai, potential buyers were recalculating their risk assessments. And in small mining towns across Burkina Faso, workers crowded around mobile phones streaming the broadcast, watching their labor being validated in real time. The auction itself was structured simply. Registered buyers could submit bids electronically. The starting price was set at $1,950 per ounce, slightly below the London benchmark to account for the fact that this was an untested system. The government expected the bidding to be cautious. They hoped to maybe break even with international prices after accounting for the discount that African gold typically suffered. The first bid came from Istanbul, $1,975 per ounce. Then Doha, $1,990. Mumbai, $2,010. Singapore, $2,025. And finally, a consortium from Dubai settled it at $2,050 per ounce, actually above the London benchmark when the transaction closed. In the monitoring room in Ouagadougou, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then someone started clapping. Then everyone. Not because they'd made a profit, though they had, but because they'd just proven something that powerful people in distant capitals had insisted was impossible. African gold sold transparently could command the same price as gold sold through the traditional opacity of the established system. The payment came through within 48 hours. Not weeks, not months, 48 hours. And here's where the story gets even more interesting, because what happened next showed that this wasn't just about economics. Within 72 hours of the payment clearing, miners in 3 different regions of Burkina Faso received their delayed wages, not partial payments, full wages. A miner named Musa, who earned about $500 a month and hadn't been paid in 6 weeks, walked into a local bank and found his account finally updated. He bought food for his family that evening. His children went to bed with full stomachs for the first time in weeks. In the town of Bobo Dioulasso, a school that had been operating without electricity for 2 months because the local government couldn't afford the repairs, suddenly had crews working to restore power. The funding came directly from auction revenues earmarked for community development. This is what sovereignty looks like when it's not theoretical, when it's not just speeches and flags and anthems. It looks like wages paid on time, lights in classrooms, families eating dinner without anxiety. But the story was only beginning. The response from the traditional power centers came swiftly, though not in the way most people expected. There were no official statements condemning Burkina Faso, no sanctions announced, no diplomatic cables leaked to the press warning of consequences. The pushback was far more sophisticated than that. It started with insurance companies. Firms that had been providing coverage for African gold shipments for years suddenly announced they were reviewing their risk assessment protocols for the Sahel region. They didn't mention Burkina Faso by name. They didn't need to. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. Then came the banks. Transactions that should have been routine started requiring additional documentation. Not official documents, just supplementary verification materials that nobody could quite define. Bank officers in New York and Frankfurt would call their counterparts in Ouagadougou and apologize profusely while explaining that new internal compliance procedures required, well, more compliance. European refineries, the ones that had processed African gold for generations, began issuing statements about their commitment to the highest standards of due diligence. Again, no direct mention of Burkina Faso. Just enough ambiguity to create doubt in the minds of potential buyers. The financial media picked up the narrative. Articles appeared in respected publications questioning whether Burkina Faso's transparent auctions could really guarantee the provenance of their gold. Think pieces analyzed the risks of bypassing traditional channels. Experts were quoted expressing concern about the lack of established oversight mechanisms. It was a masterclass in soft power. No one said Burkina Faso was doing anything wrong. They just raised questions, created uncertainty, planted seeds of doubt. In the world of commodity trading, doubt is often enough. A shipment of gold bars that should have left Ouagadougou for Dubai found itself delayed at the airport, not officially held, just pending additional clearance procedures. The cargo sat in a secure facility while paperwork was reviewed, re-reviewed, and reviewed again. Meanwhile, buyers were getting nervous. Storage costs were accumulating. Insurance premiums were ticking upward. In mining towns, the anxiety returned. Would the next auction happen? Would buyers show up? Would the wages that had just started flowing reliably dry up again? Traore's government faced a choice. They could quietly reach out to the traditional intermediaries, hat in hand, and ask what it would take to smooth things over. They could scale back the transparency, hide some of the details, make the process a bit more opaque and therefore more acceptable to the gatekeepers of the old system. Or they could double down. 2 weeks after the first auction's success, Burkina Faso's Ministry of Finance published a document that would change the game entirely. It was 247 pages long, translated into 6 languages, and made available as a free download on government websites and through partnerships with African news organizations. The title was simple: A Complete Account of Gold Auction Number 1. But the content was devastating. The document laid out every single step of the auction process. Laboratory reports from 3 independent assayers, 1 from South Africa, 1 from Switzerland, and 1 from Canada. Chemical analysis showing purity levels that exceeded industry standards. Photographs of every single gold bar from multiple angles, with serial numbers clearly visible. Then came the custody chain. Names, signatures, timestamps, GPS coordinates. From the moment gold left the mine until it entered the vault, every person who touched it, every vehicle that transported it, every door it passed through was documented with timestamps accurate to the second and locations accurate to the meter. The insurance contracts were included in full, not summaries. The actual contracts with only the premium amounts redacted to protect commercial sensitivity. Buyers could see exactly what coverage was in place, what scenarios were protected, what the terms and conditions stated. Payment receipts were shown, the exact amount received, the date and time of transfer, the originating bank, the intermediary banks, if any, and the final destination account. Everything short of the actual account numbers was there for inspection. And then came the most powerful section. The document included a side-by-side comparison. On one side, statements from insurance companies and banks about heightened risk and additional due diligence requirements. On the other side, the actual evidence from the auction. Where was the heightened risk when 3 independent assayers confirmed purity? Where was the lack of due diligence when the custody chain was tracked more carefully than most Western gold transfers? The document ended with a simple invitation. We welcome any institution to identify specific deficiencies in this process. We will address all legitimate concerns with equal transparency. It was intellectual judo. Instead of defending against vague accusations, Burkina Faso had forced the accusers to be specific, and specificity was the last thing the traditional system wanted. Within days, something interesting started happening. Smaller insurance firms, ones not deeply embedded in the old corridor system, began reaching out to Ouagadougou. They'd reviewed the dossier. They saw an opportunity. If the documentation was truly this thorough, they could price the risk accurately and probably offer better rates than the big firms that were playing political games. A reinsurance company in London, one that provides insurance to insurance companies, quietly sent a delegation to Burkina Faso. Their assessment, delivered in a confidential report that nevertheless leaked to the press, concluded that, based solely on technical merit, the transparency measures implemented exceed standard practices in the commodity sector. The corridor was cracking. When Burkina Faso announced the second auction, the stakes were entirely different. This wasn't an experiment anymore. This was a test of whether transparency could actually become a sustainable alternative to the traditional system. The government made one significant change. Before the bidding opened, they live-streamed the entire insurance contract negotiation. Not a summary, not highlights. The actual meeting between Burkina Faso officials and insurance representatives, with lawyers present, cameras running, and every clause discussed openly. Viewers watched as the insurance company initially proposed a 12% premium, citing regional instability factors. The Burkinabe negotiator calmly pulled up data showing that gold shipments from the country had a lower incident rate than shipments from 3 European nations. The premium dropped to 8%. Then the negotiator showed the security protocols from the first auction, the GPS tracking, the multiple custody handoffs. The premium dropped to 6.5%, which was actually below the industry average. This wasn't just about getting a better deal. This was about showing that African nations could negotiate on equal terms when they negotiated in public. Secrecy had always benefited the powerful. Sunlight, it turned out, was a remarkably effective disinfectant. The auction itself drew twice as many registered bidders as the first one. Jewelry manufacturers from Italy, electronics companies from South Korea that needed gold for components, investment firms from Singapore building physical gold reserves. The starting price was set at $2,000 per ounce this time, reflecting the confidence from the first auction success. The bidding was fierce. It opened at $2,015, jumped to $2,035 within minutes, and finally settled at $2,068 per ounce. Higher than London, higher than New York. The gold from a landlocked West African nation was commanding a premium over the traditional trading centers. Why? Because buyers realized something important. The transparency that made traditional gatekeepers uncomfortable actually reduced risk for legitimate buyers. When you can verify every detail, when you can see the entire chain of custody, when you can download the laboratory results and check them against your own analysis, you're not taking anyone's word for anything. You're dealing in facts. The second auction generated $89 million in direct revenue, but more importantly, it generated proof that the first auction wasn't a fluke. It demonstrated repeatability. And in the world of international trade, repeatability is everything. The effects rippled outward fast. In neighboring Mali, officials started asking questions about their own gold exports. Why were they accepting the traditional corridor when Burkina Faso was getting premium prices in open markets? In Ghana, opposition politicians began demanding transparency about mining contracts. In Nigeria, civil society organizations started publishing analyses comparing the revenues Nigeria generated from oil with what similar resources generated in countries with more transparent systems. The Pan-African conversation was shifting. For so long, the debate had been about resource nationalism versus foreign investment, about state control versus free markets. Suddenly, there was a third option: transparent markets where African nations didn't have to choose between sovereignty and profit because transparency delivered both. But the old system wasn't finished fighting. The leak came from an unlikely source, a mid-level staffer at the State Department who'd grown disillusioned with what they saw as hypocrisy in American trade policy. They'd been working on African economic development programs while simultaneously watching diplomatic cables that seemed designed to undermine the very independence those programs claimed to promote. The cables were stunning, not because they revealed anything particularly scandalous, but because they revealed how mundane the manipulation had become. One cable, dated 3 months before Burkina Faso's first auction, outlined a strategy to maintain influence over Sahelian commodity flows through coordination with European partners on insurance and banking standards. Another cable discussed the importance of ensuring that African gold continued to move through established verification channels rather than alternative markets that could reduce Western leverage in the region. There was no smoking gun suggesting illegal activity. No conspiracy to commit fraud. Just a calm, bureaucratic discussion of how to structure the international financial system in ways that kept African resources flowing through gates controlled by Western institutions. The most damaging cable was perhaps the briefest. In response to a question about whether the proposed compliance corridor had any basis in international law, a legal advisor had written, "No formal legal requirement exists. This is a coordination mechanism based on voluntary industry participation and diplomatic encouragement." In other words, the corridor that had strangled African gold exports for years, that had created the African discount, that had delayed wages for miners and starved schools of funding, wasn't actually required by any law or treaty or regulation. It was just something that powerful nations had decided to do, and everyone else had gone along with because they had no choice. Until now. Traore's government didn't gloat when the cables leaked. They didn't issue angry denunciations. Instead, they did something far more effective. They compiled every public statement that had questioned Burkina Faso's auctions, every article that had raised concerns about risk and due diligence, every warning from insurance companies and banks about the need for additional verification. Then they published all of it in a second dossier alongside the Washington cables. The implicit message was devastating. You questioned our transparency while operating through backroom coordination. You demanded our documentation while refusing to show your own legal basis. You spoke of risk while creating a system designed to extract value rather than measure actual danger. The document went viral across African social media. Young people in Lagos and Nairobi and Kampala shared it with a mix of vindication and anger. Here, finally, was proof of what many had long suspected. The rules weren't designed to protect anyone. They were designed to control. But the story still had one more twist. 3 weeks after the Washington cables leaked, something extraordinary happened. A consortium of European buyers, including jewelry manufacturers from Germany, industrial users from France, and investment firms from Switzerland, issued a joint statement. After independent review of documentation provided by the government of Burkina Faso, the statement read, "We confirm that the chain of custody and verification process exceed industry standards. We are pleased to announce our participation in future auctions." Read that again. European companies, the very institutions that were supposed to benefit from the traditional corridor system, had just validated the alternative that Burkina Faso had built. Why would they do this? Because at the end of the day, legitimate businesses actually prefer transparency. The opacity of the old system helped middlemen and gatekeepers, but it created headaches for companies that just wanted to buy gold at fair prices with clear documentation. When Burkina Faso offered them something better, they took it. The third auction was a coronation. Gold sold at $2,174 per ounce. Buyers from 17 countries participated. Major logistics companies announced new shipping routes that bypassed the traditional European hubs entirely, running from Ouagadougou through Accra to Dubai, or from Ouagadougou through Abidjan to Singapore. The African discount had evaporated. Not because anyone had legislated it away, not because international organizations had intervened, but because one country had decided to turn on the lights and invite the world to see what had been hidden in the shadows. Let's zoom out and understand what actually happened here, because this is about far more than gold. For decades, the global economy has been structured around what economists politely call information asymmetries. That's a fancy way of saying some people know things that other people don't, and they profit from that gap. The compliance corridor was an information asymmetry machine. African nations didn't know exactly why their gold sold for less. They didn't know exactly which documents were truly necessary and which were just invented requirements. They didn't know whether the risks that insurance companies charged premium prices to cover were real or imagined. Burkina Faso collapsed that asymmetry. By documenting everything, by making every step visible, they eliminated the gap between what they knew and what the market knew, and in doing so, they eliminated the ability of middlemen to extract value simply by controlling information. This is what economic sovereignty actually looks like in the 21st century. It's not about building walls or rejecting foreign investment or returning to autarky. It's about ensuring that trade happens on terms that are visible, verifiable, and fair. It's about insisting that if someone calls something risky, they have to explain exactly what the risk is and show their work. The human impact is already visible. In mining regions across Burkina Faso, wages are being paid reliably for the first time in years. Schools that had been operating without electricity or textbooks are receiving funding from auction revenues. Small businesses that depend on miners having money to spend are thriving again. But the deeper impact might be psychological. For generations, African nations were told implicitly and sometimes explicitly that they lacked the institutional capacity to manage their own resources according to international standards, that they needed oversight from outside. That independence came with a price tag measured in lost investment and economic isolation. Burkina Faso just proved that narrative was always a lie. The capacity was always there. What was missing was the courage to use it in defiance of a system that benefited from African self-doubt. Other nations are watching closely. Mali has announced plans to review its mining contracts with an eye toward greater transparency. Niger is exploring public auction systems for uranium. Ghana is considering reforms to its gold sector that would require public documentation of the sort Burkina Faso pioneered. This is how change actually happens. Not through international conferences or development programs or loans with conditions attached, but through demonstration. One country shows it's possible, and suddenly it becomes impossible to claim it's not. The traditional gatekeepers haven't given up, of course. They're adapting. Some insurance companies are now offering premium transparency packages for African gold shipments, essentially trying to monetize the very transparency they once resisted. Banks are advertising their willingness to work with non-traditional trade routes, as if Burkina Faso's routes were the alternative rather than the original European corridor. But the fundamental dynamic has shifted. It's no longer about whether African nations can manage transparent systems. It's about whether Western institutions can compete with the standards that African nations are setting. So here's where we are. A 34-year-old military officer in one of the world's poorest countries just rewrote the rules of international commodity trading, not by force, not by decree, but by insisting on transparency and backing it up with documentation so thorough that even skeptics had to acknowledge its validity. Ibrahim Traoré didn't ask permission to build a fair system. He built it and invited the world to participate. And when the world saw what he'd built, enough of the world said yes that the old gatekeepers couldn't say no anymore. This raises a question that extends far beyond gold, far beyond Burkina Faso, far beyond even Africa. If transparency can break the power of hidden corridors in commodity trading, where else can it be applied? What about pharmaceutical pricing, where the costs of production are hidden behind intellectual property claims? What about carbon credit markets, where it's nearly impossible to verify whether purchased offsets represent real environmental benefits? What about currency exchange systems that extract enormous fees from migrant workers sending money home to their families? How many of the systems we accept as inevitable are actually just corridors that nobody voted for, maintained by information asymmetries that serve the powerful? Burkina Faso didn't just challenge a system. They provided a blueprint for how to challenge systems. Document everything. Invite scrutiny. Let facts replace rumors. Force critics to be specific rather than vague. And, most importantly, build the alternative rather than just complaining about the status quo. This is what sovereignty looks like in an interconnected world. Not isolation, not rejection of global trade, but participation on terms that are transparent and therefore fair. The gold auctions continue. Each one generates revenue that flows directly into communities that have been waiting generations for their resources to benefit them, rather than enriching distant shareholders. Each one demonstrates that African nations don't need to choose between dignity and prosperity, because transparency delivers both. And each one asks the rest of the world a simple question. If this is possible for gold in Burkina Faso, what else is possible everywhere else? The answer to that question will shape the next chapter of global economics, but one thing is already clear. The corridor nobody voted for is crumbling, and no amount of careful wording from insurance companies or diplomatic cables from Washington can rebuild it. Because once you've seen what transparency looks like, once you've watched governments publish contracts in real time and gold sell at fair prices and miners receive their wages without delay, it becomes impossible to accept the old excuses for why things have to remain hidden. The lights are on now, and they're not going out.